But what we really want people to take away from this is that disability promotes accessibility, and accessibility promotes emerging technologies. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the HearSay podcast. I'm your host, Mike Paciello, Chief Accessibility Officer here at AudioEye. Today, I have the privilege of chatting with a friend and longtime colleague in the accessibility industry, Gareth Ford Williams. Gareth and I have known each other since his days at the BBC, where he and his team did some outstanding landmark work in captioning and audio description. Gareth, thanks for joining us from across the pond in the UK. Gareth, when was the first time you and I met each other? I'm thinking it was at CSUN in San Diego.
Yes, it was. I'm pretty
Right?
sure it was. Yeah, it must have been around 2012, maybe 2011. It's somewhere around about there.
Yeah, the first CSUN was in San Diego. Was 2010.
Yeah.
I remember because I was chair that year, and all I remember is I think either running into the hall or getting a message from you and saying, "Hey, Mike, I'd like to have breakfast with you." And and then we got down, and if you remember, breakfast started. So when are you going to stop punching my people? Ian at Los Henny.
Oh, yeah. Ian and Henny had already moved. Yeah, that was it. It was like, we need to talk about that. No, it was brilliant.
Yeah,
actually.
exactly. You're ruining my team here at BBC.
Yeah, it was like you're moving. Yeah, but the thing is, it was one of those moments where you offered them both opportunities that you just when you see something as a progression of that, and TPG was such a a phenomenal. It was just like we all looked at TPG so often for so many ideas and leadership, people that were there. There's an incredible culture and stuff that was there, and I remember them both talking to me about the offers, and I was like, yeah, if you do not accept, then I'm going to have words with you about this, because it was such a great move. But this is the thing is with you, we're dealing with this. It was a much smaller community then, and people went around and actually that whole thing is moving on, taking the things that the BBC stuff with them. I knew that would enrich your culture a bit as well.
Right.
So there was kind of we were some of us would go to yourself, and then I always said, one day you might come back, and then we bring some TPG back, and it's and this is that whole thing. The teams seem to feed each other, and it was great. And but I remember that breakfast. Yeah,
I remember just go back. We're going to test one another, see what I was thinking to myself, am I on good ground here, or where is this all going to go?
Yeah, it was just at the point where I was getting Jamie onto the team, Jamie Knight. So it was just as he was moving in, those two. And I was like, oh.
I think I can remember you saying, stay away from Jamie. And Ian Hamilton was already doing some work for me too, because he and I were going into gaming. So I wanted to get some of his, and I didn't realize that he had worked at the BBC. So
he was one of the first people I met. It's and probably one of the reasons, actually, I can actually kind of partly blame him for me ending up doing the career that I did. And I didn't know him yet, but I used some of the work that I'd seen he'd done as in really early discussions, and saying, why in the BBC? Because he was working just on children's games for the under sixes, and I was like, why are they getting that right there? And for everything, what's happening everywhere else? Why is that bit right? And I didn't realise that was Ian. And he was always a force of nature, and a brilliant one at that. But
ever since then, you and I have been kind of joined at the hips on a lot of different things. So I'm hoping today we could talk a little bit, share a little bit of not just our history, but our our viewpoints on various topics. And I know we've got more than a few things to talk about today. But I don't know if everybody knows you the way I know you. That a lot of the accessibility world knows you, but maybe just take us back a little bit to how did you get into accessibility? What were the drivers for you? Any anecdotal experiences that you could share with us?
It's one of these. Everyone has an adventure into accessibility. No one has a straight path in. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's gone, I decided I was going to do that and I followed a certain route. We all have epiphanies somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
But mine, I mean, I suppose I always say that I had a very privileged upbringing, in the fact that my dad, he's no longer with us, but he was a drama therapist and worked a lot with disabled children. Actually, it was before I was born. He was working with children of US air services over in the UK, and then he took this job in Manchester, running a residential school for children who were all aphasic, but there was many other conditions and syndromes and all sorts within this group. But it was a residential school, quite small, but the kids all lived there. They came from all sorts of different other local authorities and other towns, etc. And we lived on site, and it became like an extended family. You know, they were my friends that I played with after school. You know, our back garden was also the school playground, and it was just one of those things. It was that kind of experience of just, you know, never having a problem with it. Because I think of our generation, Mike, and you know, we're not far off, roughly the same age, and I think we kind of, you know, lots of kids were taken out of their communities. You know,
Right.
people did not have the privilege of growing up with knowing people, and I think, you know, there's a wonderful thing that happens nowadays, that the kids are growing up with their peers properly, but it created problems. It sort of solved problems and create problems, and I didn't experience that separation. And it was just one of those things where, you know, I went off. I did art school and ended up working in advertising, and ended up joining the BBC as a brand manager. And one of my kids has cerebral palsy, Zach, and
Yep.
who's now an actor and appearing on screen all over the place now. So he's going to be 25 this year, and he was 6 at the time. And I was at the BBC, and I could see this one thing going on, and I had a chance meeting with a guy who I didn't know who he was, outside a lift that wasn't coming in the television centre in London. We ended up having a long chat, and but the chat grew. I didn't realise he was controller of BBC.co.uk at the time, and this conversation with a chap called Tony Aggie, who's an absolute visionary, wonderful man. He now runs digital at New York Public Library, and he knew that there was a problem, because the BBC's must have the longest running accessibility program of any organisation in the world, because it started out as an employment scheme for engineers coming back from World War One, of which there were a lot of people with injuries, with PTSD, with all sorts of stuff. And even the first director general, who's like the CEO of the BBC, the first director general was severely vision impaired, because he'd been shot in the face in the trenches. He was an officer, and he'd lost one eye, and it had a history. It funded wirelesses for the blind in the 1920s, invented in-vision signing in 1957. It invented closed captioning, subtitling, which became part of the teletext platform. The year I was born, that was kind of, I suppose, was invented in 1969, and first service in the world in 1979. And
you were born in 69?
I was, yeah.
I got a decade on you, man.
Yeah, so, mate, there we go. You're looking young, mate. Well, I'm looking old. I'm not quite sure which one it is.
We're in the same generation, but we're really not, man. But anyway, so go ahead.
But anyway, so it's and they built the first ever audio description, you know, sort of production systems, and so there was this whole fabulous background, and yet digital, no one had a plan.
Right.
And I just pointed this out. It was a conversation. I wasn't after anything or trying to make a pitch for anything, but I got into this conversation. And you get into these conversations, and then you suddenly realise that you're the one responsible for it, because everyone's turning to you, going, "How are we going to do this?" And then Tony was absolutely wonderful, man, and he said, "Look, I've got this project. We're going to build a prototype for a thing that we've had this idea for." And we've not really I don't think they had permission to build it quite yet. There's a lot of skunk works with Tony. He said, "Join that team. It's fine. The train's left the station. It's going to happen." He said, "Build everything accessible there. Find out what it means. Do everything. We'll learn on this one project, and then we will spread that across the organisation." And
so
that became... that became BBC iPlayer.
I was going to say,
That
so
was
this is your entree into accessibility
yeah,
as we
straight.
know it. Okay,
Yeah.
so go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead. So talk
No,
about that.
and the senior managers just said it has to be as least as accessible as TV. And
Okay,
they were heading towards 100% closed captioning. This was about 2005, 2004, 2005. They were already at 100, heading towards 100% on captioning. They were doing masses of audio description, sign language interpretation. They wanted it. They said, and the rest. We want
yeah,
this, and the path through to everything. So we did this. We formed a little team, and we had permission just to find out as much as we could, and we did masses of user research, loads of testing, loads of all sorts of stuff. There was a lot of innovative stuff came out of it, and and that's kind of how it began, and it just blossomed from there, and we just grew the program and came up with all sorts of different things over the years, and I was in charge of that for 18 years, I think, the BBC.
wow,
So
amazing.
it was,
Amazing.
yeah.
In terms of timelines, though, too. In our last show we had Larry Goldberg with us, right? So
Mm.
Larry and I go back a long time too, as well, when he was over at WGBH and NCAM. So a couple of things here, because I know the BBC pretty much has been a big, huge promoter of. Now, do you guys actually? And when I say you guys, I mean in the UK. Is it subtitles that you call, or do you still
Well,
say closed
the man who
caption?
invented them called them closed caption subtitles.
Right. Oh,
and
ah,
his guy called Professor Alan Newell, and I don't know
yeah.
if he's still with us, but Alan Newell invented them. And
I didn't realize that. I was just going to
yeah,
bring up Alan's name. I was going to say, do you know Alan? Alan, I've got a couple of videos right here in my library that I work with him on, and we watched and then watched his. Remember, he had his actors workshop, and we
yeah,
would go. They were
all the
acting out.
theatre in the round, amazing. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely amazing. Yeah. He's quite another visionary, another
yeah,
extraordinary individual.
awesome.
Larry would always correct me and say, "Yeah, but WGBH got the first caption service out, but it was open captioning."
Right. Okay.
They beat the BBC by about 8 years or something to actually
Was it?
building
Yeah.
the caption service, but theirs was open. The BBC was investing in building a closed caption platform, so it was WGBH were amazing. Another pioneer.
When you said 2004, 2005, and I knew what Larry's timeline was, I was
Mm,
wondering what the deal was, but that makes sense. So they started out right. And Larry mentioned that when we talked about starting out with open captions.
yeah.
But I can't believe you brought up Alan Newell's. And I literally, right here in my notes, I was going to say, I got to bring up Alan Newell.
Yeah,
You know who introduced me to Alan Newell?
go
David
on.
Sloan.
Ah,
David
right, of
Sloan.
course,
Yeah,
yes.
because he
Yeah,
was over at the University of Dundee, right? And
yeah, yeah,
was
we used to do
Alan?
a lot of work with Dundee. We
Right.
used to
Exactly.
and amazing place, and there's
Yeah.
Professor Annalou Waller
Yep.
there, who
Right.
is an absolute incredible inspiration around, systems for children that have no language,
Right.
children
Yeah.
who've never spoken, et cetera, giving children voice. She's a phenomenal researcher, and yeah, it
Yeah.
was, Alan's that department
Amazing.
there was incredible, and there was the theatre that they had there, they
Yep.
built, which
His
was
wife was the director. His wife
yeah,
was a director, right? And they would set
mm,
these things out there for the folks that are listening to us, just to kind of visualize this just a little bit. We're talking about a typical actor's studio, but these scripts were basically around the elderly and
yeah,
some of the challenges that they had in terms of technology, and people with disabilities and some of the challenges they had, at least the ones that I saw. In Al and I co-authored at least one paper together in talking about this. So kind of amazing that, man, what a little world. I didn't
oh,
realize
yeah.
it.
The methodology was weirdly enough, it was based on something that my dad had told me about years ago, and it's a thing called the theatre of the oppressed, and I think the man who invented it was called Augustus Boal, who's an Argentinian theatre director who, he developed this idea during the time when fascism was in power in Argentina, and people disappeared for having opinions. Many people disappeared, and he created this idea where you couldn't put on political plays, but the audience could stop the play that he was producing at any point and comment on it, and the actors had to change because they're going to go, "That's not the way it is." this is the way that life is. These are the challenges we have. And the play would take the direction based on the feedback of the audience. And so
Yeah.
the actors would have to improvise, and then they could explore political themes through it without being arrested. Because, and he got round this. And then Alan took this idea and said, this is brilliant. So we will show these situations, these plays, and the audience can stop it at any point. People can turn around and say, no, 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 I find this happens, or this is the way I understand that to be. And then discussions would happen in the audience, because then someone else pipe up and go, and then start giving information. And they had note takers in the audience, and they start capturing this, because the audience would be talking about the actors, not themselves. There was less pressure on them.
Right.
But then they would put their experiences, they would transfer them onto that. And it was genius. It was such a clever idea for user research. That was absolutely brilliant.
I've been to dinner theaters more than a couple of times, and that's the exact kind of thing. Or it's kind of a who done it, and then at the end you get to pick who did it, and then they build a whole scenario around that and everything. So that's pretty cool. Hey, so 2004, 2005 timeframe, you're chartered with making iPlayer functionally, really, from my perspective, this is media accessibility 101, right? Never mind digital technology. This is media accessibility. So kind of walk me through what ideas came up out of that? What did you do differently? What did you discover that just absolutely blew you away?
Well, it was an interesting one, because no one had done long form video before online. It was the first VOD service. And so it was it came from a brainstorming session with way too much beer between Tony and a friend of his, Ben Lavender, and they were just round at Tony's, drinking and writing stuff down. And it was literally one of those things where Ben had come up with this idea of saying, hang on a minute, loads of people are doing peer-to-peer networks and sharing our content. Why don't we torrent our own content at the BBC? Why don't we use that as a platform? Because at the time, networks could not support the bandwidth of streaming platforms. And so the whole thing started as a peer-to-peer idea. And we had to take on board, the idea that broadcast technology and web technology did not match at all. There was no interface between the two. And that was one of the biggest challenges. So there was a wonderful guy called Andrew Strachan, who was on the team as an engineer, and he was there, came to try and work out, how do we interface? How do we draw this stuff down from broadcast and then capture it? And we kind of went through lots of different iterations, particularly around closed captioning. InVision signing was fine. That was great. That was already burnt in. We just created a new channel for it. And the biggest and trickiest one out of them was audio description, because we wanted all of this from launch. We wanted it. It was, and this is what the exec said. They said, if it's going out on broadcast, it's going out on iPlayer. There's not going to be disparity between these things. And we ended up, it was one of the worst hacks ever, because we could not get the thing to work. And so the end up hack was literally a cupboard with a bunch of set-top boxes on it. We had I think we had 8 channels. And we were recording off the set-top boxes with the audio description on, and recording it straight onto hard drive, clipping it up and mixing it in an edit suite and shoving it back onto and this was hand cranked for, I can't remember how many years, but it was the only way we could do it until someone redesigned and rebuilt the systems and sat down and thought about, how are we going to make these standards work? Because this is totally incompatible. We cannot make this work any other way. And that's the thing with accessibility. As long as the audience doesn't know, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. The audience loved it, and we're like, brilliant, it's there. They didn't know that there was, this was held together with tape and string behind the scenes.
Exactly.
and a lot of hope and prayer. This is still working, and it worked for a long time, until convergence happens, until things get reprocured and redesigned, and then you can architect these into the production workflows, and wonderful people come along like Nigel Meggitt, who and Nigel then turns around and does things. He took over after Andrew, and then started thinking about coming up with a common standard for closed caption subtitling. I'm going to use the full name, closed caption subtitling across, all platforms, which was EBUTTD. And,
Right.
and how do we make this work? But yeah, there was always these things, and having to build, I think we went through about 3 different versions. We actually built 3 products before one went live. But how do we make the whole thing screen reader accessible? How do we make sure people understand it? How do we take the language of the web and the language of broadcast of team and pull them together? I remember doing studies where we were going out just talking to people about the language that we were using, and understanding whether we were talking about things like potentially streaming, because they're a little bit, it was after launch, I think it was close towards iPlayer 2, a couple of years after. We were talking about people, no one knew what streaming was.
Right.
No one knew what it was. These things hadn't developed as language. And I remember, people could work out download. Yeah, I can go, something's going to, that sounds like something's going to appear. I can get that. But you're talking about a small wet thing that flows into a bigger wet thing that flows into the biggest wet thing. What's that got to do with TV?
Exactly. Exactly. That's a great point. I hadn't thought about, never mind the challenges of accessibility, in building an interface, in building a technology that's usable and accessible to individuals with disabilities. And I want to come back to that just in a second on the player. But the reality is that you are literally talking about 2 different technological industries, right?
Yeah.
Who are speaking different languages. And now you've got to mash them together, right? I don't know any other way to describe it. Mash them together and get everybody on the same page so that you've got something complementary that's working for everybody.
Oh yeah. And it was a wonderful thing. The thing is, so much opportunity came off the back of this, and because the BBC had gone to things like full closed cap, everything was closed caption subtitle. One of the realizations we had is we had now the richest source of time-coded metadata, of narrative metadata, against everything that was being archived. And then we also then realized with the audio description that was coming through, there's about 40+% of the content roughly, but that was only 40% needed audio describing. The rest is reportage of some description. So everything is spoken. And there was another thing called bimedia production that was done by the BBC since the 90s, where they used to say all reportage should be presented as if there are no images. And it was, and so all news, etc. You didn't need to see it. You can listen to it like radio. And so the idea was, this 40%, suddenly we have descriptive metadata that sat in the audio description. And so suddenly this becomes archive metadata because it's time-coded scripts. And so you can search for descriptions and search for narrative and find clips. And it basically, powers the search of the archive. And that kind of metadata to do for that kind of, a massive would have cost a fortune. It would be unaffordable.
And just think about it again. If you're visualizing this from an audience standpoint, think about, when I first started, everything was reel to reel, right? And when you had to search and go back reel to reel, you go through all that, it was a nightmare. Then we thought, hey, we've gotten clever. We put everything on CD and then DVD, and now it's on a hard drive, and we can kind of search it, but still indexing and searching for things at that level. And never mind that kind of, as you said, the metadata, the granularity, of that kind of metadata and searching for that. It really wasn't possible to do that on a DVD or CD. So it wasn't until we got the web. So we've got streamed media where now the hooks can get in there and we can look inside that thing and start looking for, whatever narrative and metadata, flag it, use that to create other things. It's media gone wild.
We always say that accessibility affords other things, and it always surprises me the things that come along. And you go,
accessibility has become a driver for advanced technologies that people don't realize. I mean, you could go back and the typical story is, well, Alexander Graham Bell, right? So he did he built this, he built this, so that he could talk. Or in more modern day, Vint Cerf, in working with his team at DARPA and creating, the first instances of basically chat over a network, right? Over the internet, and coming up with that so that he could communicate with it, because he's hard of hearing, almost deaf, and his wife is, I think, hard of hearing as well. So those kind of stories are good, But what we really want people to take away from this is that disability promotes accessibility, and accessibility promotes emerging technologies.
Oh, well,
So,
absolutely.
right,
Absolutely. There's so much opportunity comes off it. This is why it should never be an afterthought. This is why it should be embedded, because
yep, right,
it gives flex, it adds metadata, it adds, design redundancy, it does all of these wonderful things. And
yep,
then you find people take advantage of that. Audiences' behaviors change. And we look at the mainstreaming of assistive technology now, whole platforms, Alexa, etc. These things are built on assistive technology.
yeah,
And if we didn't have text to speech engines and we didn't have speech to text engines, we would not have Alexa and Dot.
right, right,
It gives there's always those things when we used to talk about it in certainly at BBC, and it was an interesting one. The BBC never had to sell it in. The whole point of the BBC is for everyone, and they never caveated the word everyone. We just had to try and work out so what everyone meant, and that was a continuous kind of long discussion, because you're
yeah,
constantly finding out more and more interesting things about other people, and then we need to think about that in terms of everyone, and so there was yeah, it kind of the affordances off the back of it is quite extraordinary, and there's loads of little moments. I mean, when we were before Henny and Ian came to work for you, and there was me and Henny and Ian and Al Duggan, and
I
I'll
knew
give
Al,
her
yeah,
full. Yeah, oh yeah, Al was like the first
yeah,
official accessibility champion.
yeah,
He was the principal developer working on the 2012 Olympics. We knew the 2012 Olympics was coming. We couldn't put it off, and we were rebuilding all our applications. We were putting out, there was an Olympics app, there was new sports apps and stuff, and the brief was they all have to be accessible. And in 2010 there were no accessibility guidelines for mobile, so we just went, well, we can't hang around and wait for the working groups to get themselves together on this. We're just going to have to do it. And full credit to Henny. I mean, Henny was the driving force behind it. Absolutely extraordinary. And it was that we tried things out. We found an application. We tried things out. We learned. We captured everything we learned. We understood what didn't go well, and then we tried something else out to fix it. And we went through probably 4 or 5 applications and getting better and better and better at it.
very cool.
And I remember actually it was Leonie got in touch with us when we finally did the weather app. We got to that point, and I remember Leonie contacting either Henny or Ian, or it was on a. I can't remember where they picked this up, but it was
Yeah.
Leonie saying it was the first application that she couldn't break. and
We were
and
talking
I,
about Leone. For folks that don't know, Leone Watson worked for me at TPG, and now she is one of the co-founders of Tetralogical. But
right,
she's got a media background. Before she lost her sight, I think she was in journalism or something along
yeah,
those lines. So not
but
surprised.
yeah,
I wanted to take you back to so you and I have these career paths that are kind of interesting. You went off, you worked for the BBC, so you were with this large media organization, and I went off the entrepreneurial way and started TPG and building that. Now, tell me about, what it was like building challenges and who and what you thought about in terms of the accessible organization, right? The accessibility maturity map, the organization that supports accessibility and people with disabilities. Tell me about, because from the way I understand things, and I know you've got your own mentors, you basically brought some organization and built something that is a model for
yeah.
for an organization within a large corporate environment.
It was, yeah. I mean, there was there was an enormous amount of experimentation. I like to say sometimes I spent 18 years making accessibility mistakes so other people couldn't have to. It was we because when you know what it's like, when you're looking at something going, well, no one's done that before, so let's try it out. Let's
Right.
and being prepared to fail was something that was fine. There was an organization that was, I mean, it didn't sell anything. There was no commercial side to this. There was no commercial imperative. There were these really odd currencies people would talk about, like public value, which no one could really describe what it meant. But is there a lot of public value in this? Yeah, there's a lot of public value. Oh, that's good then. And so you'd have these very odd conversations, and there was this very odd language that went around it. But you kind of, once you tuned into that in the organization would say, it's okay to fail. We have to try, and we have to be seen to try.
Exactly.
It gave you that opportunity to innovate. And the thing is, I mean, it wasn't just me. I mean, I was just the gobby one who went around annoying everyone. You know, I found there was an incredible community that grew up, and because I knew I couldn't scale, we couldn't have a big team. The BBC's not a rich organisation because it doesn't really have an income beyond a thing called a license fee, which is spread incredibly thin. And so, you know, really early on, when we were all pretty much all based in London at that point, nearly not everyone, but most of the digital folk were in the centre of London or in the West End. And I got permission to send out an email. And this was really early. This was probably 2005. And just out to the whole division, a couple of thousand people at least. And just to say, hey, I'm doing this thing over here called accessibility, you know, come to the boardroom. I have loads of sandwiches, tea, whatever coming in next Thursday. I'm going to be sat in there with lots of food. Either come for a free lunch, or come because you feel sorry for me because I've got no one to have lunch with. And or come along and talk about accessibility. You don't have to know about it if you're just curious about it. And I mean, the amount of people that turned up, we couldn't get them in the room. There was a queue outside. And in there were people like Al Duggan, and in there was Ian Hamilton. That's how I met Ian for the first time and found out who he was and what he did. All these people just wanted to do stuff, and they were all from different parts of the organisation. And I thought, right, the first thing we need to do is turn this into a community. We have to turn this into something where they're the people I need to serve, so then they can serve the audience. So my concern wasn't indirectly the audience, but it was supporting the people who wanted to support. And it was kind of the first Champions Network, not in name. It didn't get called the Champions Network until about 2010. But that's where that whole thing started out, and the community drove it. And I found in these people all these different specialists, you know, incredible JavaScript engineers and developers in test and designers and editorial people and lawyers and all sorts of people who brought perspectives. And I thought I need to, you know, harness this. And then we started writing our own guidance and guidelines and started writing the first games accessibility guidelines. So I think the BBC was the first publisher ever of games to have a games accessibility guidelines.
Yep. Definitely remember
things like that in looking for the gaps and saying, who do I need in the room to help us? How do we approach this? And it was just all about asking questions and bringing people together. And it was just, I think that was that whole thing. It's what drove me, was knowing this incredible network and being interested and utterly respecting all their specialisms. And that's how we ended up doing stuff as quickly as we could. We just used the brains in the room.
I think the irony of that, though, is when you talked about, so you had a little community of folks who weren't really together, but now you brought them together. Now you created a community. And then ultimately, those folks all have gone off on their own and have joined other organizations. But they have they keep that passion, because I think probably what you saw is what I saw. And that is, there are some individuals, you know, that are just blessed with a passion for making things right for others. You know, they've got this very service-oriented mindset. And Henny and Ian, David and Leonie and Steve and Jen. I mean, I can go through.
Oh yeah.
Right, the whole team. And so my goal was, while you're over there building this thing over at the BBC, I had literally written down on a piece of paper, I am going to build a team of the world's greatest experts in accessibility. And I'm going to start. And I did one by one. And I started bringing them in. And in the end, I think I could say that I probably built, and don't take this the wrong way because I know you had a good team, but I still feel to this day that there is no greater team of individuals collectively. There were, 40 or 50 of us together, but the core people, there were about a dozen, 15 to 20 of us, literally. And the few experts that didn't work for us were because they worked for Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, and IBM, right? That was it. Everyone else,
Yeah.
we got. So it was a great team. But I think that that's something that everybody else needs to understand. You want to pursue the business of accessibility. You need to realize that you have to be surrounded by a great team. So
Oh,
start there
utterly.
first, right?
Utterly. I mean, yeah, I think there was never an agency like, it was like the Avengers,
Yeah,
TPG, there was that kind of thing. And there were so many different specialisms within it. And you're quite right. Then you have the platform teams, these big, who are all doing incredible things. And the thing I always like putting in the BBC was the only media organization at the time. It was the only content
yeah,
developer it was the first large scale producer of content to do this at scale. And you have to remember, the BBC is massive in its output. I think its audience is something like 750 million internationally now. It's massive,
it's
it's
amazing,
huge.
amazing.
And domestically it's as big as Facebook, and only the Google homepage is probably
Yeah,
bigger. It's huge across all its services.
yeah,
And it just wanted to do it all at scale immediately, because it didn't see why not. I mean, it was so
sure.
funny. The first time I went to see the director general, and we sort of laid this out in front of him, and some of the challenges and lots of the unknowns. He just sat there and just went, "Why isn't this being done already?" That was the
Yeah,
question I wanted to know: is why is this not already happening?
yep,
I just
yep,
this is not acceptable,
yep.
and we were like,
It's
"Great, okay."
That's
That's
awesome.
no pressure
Awesome.
then. It's
So that
it's
I think that's good that the people in the audience understand how critical the BBC and your work and the team's work was really for accessibility as we know it today, and it's certainly going forward in the future. But let's spin things forward a little bit. So I think it's interesting. We've kind of changed jackets, so to speak, right? So
yeah.
now you're the entrepreneur with Ably, and I'm over working with with the corporation again, with the company here. But so talk to me a little bit about Ably. I want to
Okay.
also go down a little bit about the path around cognition, accessibility, and dyslexia, and focus there. What you see as areas that we've improved on
Mm.
in room for growth.
Okay, so there's a lot that to sort of unpack in that. So yeah, when I uh, um, left the BBC, it was what was it was 2021. So it's it was one of those things. I had always had these two things in my head. One of them was Ably, and the other one has become a thing called AliQuest, which has just launched. But I had these two things that I wished I'd always had. And or at least I'd been able to get to a level of maturity. AliQuest is based on an idea that pretty much started in 2008 at the BBC, and evolved, and we've evolved it again and evolved it again. And but I never had data, and this was one of the biggest problems. I used to regularly get asked by senior management, "How's it going?" And I could lay a lot of stuff in front of them. So we had our own standards and guidelines, which is not dissimilar to WCAG's, but they were very specific about the BBC services and things. There's differences and similarities between them, but we did our own research and built our own things. And so I said, well, we're fine, everything's fine. Our slight difference was ours were a reflection of what we were already doing. They were never and I building it as an organization, we just captured the things that we achieved into our guidelines, so we never lost them. This was a way of showing the audience around, sort of policy of openness. This is the way that we build things. This is the things that we already do. And but I could say that, and we could look at complaints. Complaints have gone down, but people don't spend their life complaining. And we've done some qualitative research. So I set up a design research team. That was another one of my teams at the BBC.
Right.
And so we were doing lots of work and lots of things that were informing design. But I could never get anything that I could tell you this is what's happening to the audience. This is the impact. And then started looking around, and I realized no one had any data, and they still don't have any data. Understanding the impact is a really hard thing to do. And I'd be approached by product managers who would say, "Hey, I need to know. Let's put some people in labs. Let's do a study. Let's do focus groups." And I'd sit down and go, "Look, you've got a weekly reach of 19 million people a week. I cannot extrapolate their experiences from 30 opinions, you know, much that
Right.
I'd like to. It will unearth some stuff, but I can't honestly say. And this was the whole idea behind Ably, is to find a way of bringing inclusive design, a very social model inclusive design rather than medical model, but social model data into it, so you can understand the impact of the decisions that you make. Because we talk about it, we know instinctively, and we, you know, there is a lot of experience in it, and we know the impact that we have, but data tells the story.
Right.
Data tells the story to the whole audience, and it's been something, and it's tricky to do because you've got to be respectful about, you know, people's privacy. You've got to respect the law around data and data management, and so, you know, getting the right team together was tricky, and getting a, you know, ex senior compliance lawyer from the Google involved, and, you know,
Yeah.
those kind of people, and so this was this was the thing that we started pulling this together, and we're still in early days. We want to work finding organizations to work with to build you know, services off the back of it.
Okay.
And so that's something that we spent a lot of time. We prototyped it. We've done a lot of work with the algorithms on the readability group study, which happened, you know, sort of in the first. If you go back to the first AXCON, you'll find the readability study in as one of the presentations there. And it was a similar idea, you know, understanding, measuring need and measuring preference, rather than thinking about condition, because people can have the same conditions and have totally different needs.
Yeah, I'm
And
so glad that you said that, right? Because was it in that study? I can't remember if that's the first time I read it, but wasn't it in that study that you already questioned the value of what was starting to become popular, the dyslexic fonts? Like,
oh
I could create a font that people with dyslexia can all it'll work
yeah.
for everybody, right?
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't. Yeah, this was. There's been a lot of these things, and they're usually, you know, hypotheses that designers have, and they design a font, and then they try and prove it afterwards, which I've always found been problematic with. And we just said no. We just need to get some data, and we used the dyslexic fonts were part of it. There's always sub studies within studies, but we
Yeah.
wanted to give. I worked with three others. So there's Michael Matthews, who I also worked with on the other two projects. Bruno Marg from Dalton Marg, who's, you know, now retired and probably one of the world's greatest, if not, you know, living type designers. He's designed for everyone from USA Today, Ducati, BMW, the Rio Olympics. He did Nokia's fonts. He's done some of Google's fonts, Ubuntu, all sorts of people, and the BBC's, and lots besides. In his an incredible career, massive neuroscience nerd. He was always saying, if you don't understand how reading works and how cognition works and how people have cognitive difficulties, he's like, you can't really design a font. You can't
Yeah.
design the function. And he was always, but he was saying, but it also needs to be emotionally accessible as well as functionally accessible. People have to relate and have to love it and connect with it. And so you have emotional and functional accessibility has to be hand in hand. And so we've done this, and David Bailey, who's an incredible typographer, again, he was really famous. If you go in, if you're any graphic designers listening who study graphic design, they'll probably know who the Designers Republic were, who were an enormously famous agency in the 1990s, and David's very well known. And so we had this wonderful moment of getting together to build BBC Reef. Three of us kind of drove most of the work around that. And then we then went, let's ask questions. Let's get some data behind this. Let's understand what the things in fonts are. And we can ask questions. If you get a big enough amount of data, you can query it and ask the data questions rather than try and find data that supports your hypothesis. Bless him, Bruno, I think, said to me at one point, he said, you do realize this could undermine my entire career. And I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
quite,
Yeah, that's
you
it.
know, we have to take that on board, that this might prove us all wrong. And dyslexic fonts were part of that. And we did look for people with the audio dyslexic. I'd call it audio dyslexic trait, which would make Bruno grimace because he said there is no other dyslexia. Erlin syndrome and other things are the visual things.
Right.
But he would, you know, it was fascinating because we ended up identifying people with that trait. There was about 250 that we identified in a user group of about, it was just over 2,000. And yeah, there was less than 10% of them actually preferred their font, which meant, I mean, if 7% of people liked Open Dyslexic, there's something going right for that 7%.
Yeah.
But when 93% reject it within the study as less
Exactly.
readable and legible than everything else, there's something that's not working. So you can't turn around and say it's for dyslexia, but it seems to be there's something going on there, you know.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
if it was 0%, you could turn, if it was 0, then you'd turn around nothing. But there's always a blip. So you go, something's going right for someone,
yeah,
but we don't know what that is yet. And so, yeah, we were able to explore that. We were able to basically disprove the whole thing around serifs, which actually has never been proven. It's an
yeah.
urban myth that serifs make readability or legibility poor, because if you look at individual letter shapes, it can be one thing, but if you look at words, they are very good at forming word shapes.
Right.
And so, there's, which is why Bookily is a serif font.
Exactly.
It's all about speed reading and cadences, etc. So there was lots of stuff that we went in there, and we found all sorts of different interesting things around it. And now we've made a big chunk of that data now. The Readability Consortium, we've handed a big chunk of that data over to the Readability Consortium for them to use for further study.
Very
Um,
cool.
but
Cool.
yeah, it was one of those where it came out with more questions than answers, which I love a study that does that.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
oh, there's a load of stuff that we didn't know.
It changed. It definitely changed. I know, again, having read the papers and everything in our discussions, it changed an awful lot about the way we thought about cognition and
Mm.
dyslexia. So, kudos to you and to the team for
I'm
pulling that
dyslexic.
together.
Oh,
Now,
you always do things for yourself. I'm dyslexic. I have ADHD. You probably
eh,
guessed. Uh,
nothing wrong with that. I mean, start with, if you have a problem, it's always right there in front of you, right? So, whether
Absolutely.
you're part of it or not, either way, it works. But now let's take another step into this. You're talking about collecting massive, collections of data. Okay,
Mm,
and I know you and I have kind of talked about the AI aspect of this and
yeah,
how you feel that this is what we've got to dive into it, and this could
yeah,
be a huge, I don't know, stepping stone, may not, springboard might be a better way of looking at it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
yeah. Absolutely. Because this is all about collecting data, not only that identifies the needs of individuals, and if you don't meet the needs, you create barriers. That's where
Right.
barriers come from.
Exactly.
Accessibility isn't a thing that you add on; it's a thing that you take away and then try and add on afterwards. You know, I
Right.
always used to say at the BBC, before we've done anything, is when something's an idea, we've all got total equal access to it. It's just a concept. As soon as we start making decisions, we filter people out. And so, this was that whole thing, is if we start collecting we start understanding the needs and the preferences, and preferences always relate to coping strategies. So things that people like to do that make things easier for them. So if we understand and we can collect data around those, and then we get data about outcomes across that audience, and we can cross-reference the two, so filter one with the other, we can understand so much about the impact of our decisions on different needs and different preference groups, and this is what AIs can't do. AIs have a very singular perspective of people because we've never broken them down. And an AI is a tool that is as good as the data that you give it. There's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. We see this,
Mhm.
in
Yep.
AIs that try to write code and things, and it depends on what they've been trained on. And then they've garbage code they've looked at, they will put out garbage code because they're just copying their pattern. They're sitting there
Right.
trying to work out patterns. And and so I think if we get better data, if we're better at profiling people and better at understanding, the outcomes for them, whether they're navigational outcomes, whether they're outcomes about enjoyment, you know,
Yeah.
functional and emotional outcomes within experiences, we can understand more about the UX and technical decisions we make and the impact that it has on home, because we don't have that data. And
Right.
then using that as training data, we can then start modeling that. And it's all very well, trying to train AIs about WCAG, which is one side of it, or, whatever the technical side. If you don't have that user data, you don't understand whether that is working correctly and for whom. We've never joined
Right.
those two things up, and I think there's an enormous opportunity here. Um,
Well, that makes me think a little bit now. So, what do you think, or what's your opinion then on Jacob Nielsen's latest blog, right? Where he first of
Yeah.
all he
Oh,
tra-
controversial.
he trashes the entire accessibility industry, right? All the professions, right? And
He wrote a very silly one-liner at the beginning that I
yeah,
think was there for. He was
I,
just
I
being melodramatic, but
I
yeah,
think he was, yeah. Look, he was an attention getter, but
yeah,
he as I read through it. And I was talking with one of our own AI folks here at AudioEye. What I was intrigued about is one thing I think is obvious is scale, right? We
mm,
can't do scale right now, as everything being manual audits as we go there. That's part of the engineering life cycle. That's got to be there. But in terms of scale, it's just not going to work. But one of the things that he if I have this understand it correctly, is he's talking about collecting all this data, putting the UI interfaces together, and then creating something that becomes functionally a personalized UI, regardless of what
yeah.
the back end
But
or application is, right?
how are you going to do that without really good data? I mean, this is the thing.
Well, that's the
It's
point. That's
yeah,
exactly
yeah.
what I'm saying, right?
I think he's not right. He's not wrong. He's also not right. But and he's posing an idea. He's posing a thought,
Yes, of course.
and that's fine. Based on what we have currently, that isn't going to happen
Hmm.
until we get better at data. There's no
Yeah,
way that that can happen. And there's quite a few people. I mean, the remove those initial comments that he made. I don't think
yeah,
accessibility has failed no more than heuristics have.
right,
And
right.
you know, and
Yeah,
heuristics were written before we added cognition and neurodivergence to it. And it is so that they need updating, and because they treat everyone as having one cognitive sort of model as such, one
right,
cognitive perspective.
right.
That was the time they were written, and
Yeah,
and you can go back to Dieter Rams before that. But Dieter Rams, I think there's a wonderful phrase. I love him. I love saying that he said um, back in the early 1970s, and he said the one and only cardinal sin in design is not designing for the reality in which people live. And it's a quote that I love. And people's needs and their preferences, if not met, are their realities.
yeah,
These are our experiential things, and we have an emotional need about something. And this is another thing is I feel that we are separating with our data. We get very bogged into bogged down into the functional, and we forget about emotional data. I'm coming back with my brand manager hat on. We was all about emotional data. How people feel about the thing. Did they enjoy it? We cared about their emotion. And I did a presentation quite recently called "Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust." Where's the fun in that?
yeah.
And
So,
it
yeah,
was
yeah,
it,
yeah,
the web has grown since those things were written, and
yeah,
they're still really good principles, but they're missing.
yeah.
They're missing the emotion. They're missing the humanity of it.
Yeah,
And
they don't really speak to the user experience in terms of
yeah,
the old notion of likability and
yeah.
usability from that standpoint.
People have got to
Um,
love something. If they come to something to enjoy it and they
yeah,
don't enjoy it, they'll go away.
they'll
And
walk away.
and and it could be perfectly usable, but not fun. Just look at some of the really early accessible games. They just weren't fun. They were hugely accessible, but they
Yeah,
weren't fun. And kids just went, "Oh, it's rubbish," and just didn't want to play it.
yeah,
And this was the thing where Ian and where the games industry has been incredible in accessibility. It's because
exactly.
they care that it's all about fun and it's about fun for everyone.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so they've never separated those two things out. And we
right.
go to the web. What we go to connect with people, we go to collaborate, we go to buy things, we go to watch things, we go to enjoy things, we go to laugh, we go to cry, we go to do a lot of things that are emotional. It's become a huge part. And we need to grow our accessibility model to take that on board. And we're a long way from that at the minute.
Yeah,
It's still missing vastly around it. And I think this is where I've been working with a company called Diageo for the last couple of years, and I think they really grasped it because they're a marketing company, massive, third biggest marketing spend in the world, I think. They're
Uh-huh.
huge, and they own, it's all alcohol brands and stuff like that. But they came up with this
That's why
brilliant
they're having
within.
fun. That's why
Oh
it's
yeah.
all fun.
Well, they said it's a social product. People go out
Yeah, of
together, whether
course.
and they have non-alcoholic drinks as well as alcoholic drinks. But they said
Yeah.
they're selling to people in restaurants, in bars, in at events and family gatherings, and these groups of people are naturally diverse. They are diverse because that's humanity. And they said someone said to me there, if we're not diverse, if we're not inclusive, then we're not relevant. To our audience, we have to be relevant to them. And they had this in Bailey's, one of their brands, one of their drinks, Bailey's. They came up with this amazing idea. We played around with this whole thing about playful alt text, and they came up with this project called Delicious Descriptions. And they said, with all our marketing images, if you don't want that, if you look at the image and go, "Ooh, I'd like to try that," you've also got to read the alt text and go, "Ooh, that sounds nice." And if you don't have an
That's
emotional response to the alt text, then it's not comparative.
I love that. I love that.
Delicious
That's
descriptions.
very cool. Yeah, delicious
It's
description.
such a
So
and
listen,
they've
it's
done an
that's
amazing
great.
job on it.
Delicious descriptions. We'll definitely got to make sure we promote that. So as we wind down the show here, I did want to have you talk a little bit about CAN.
Mm. Oh yeah, Champions of Accessibility Network.
Yeah, yeah,
It's that all came about. So Accessibility Champions was this idea that we had at the BBC, and so we always had a community. And I think finally I got talking to, and Ian Pouncey was one of the people in the meeting, and there was another chap who was ex Yahoo, and I can't remember his name. He was at the BBC, and we were at lunch together. We were having a chat, and they were telling me about the champions networks at Yahoo, because you could be like a JavaScript champion and this, that, and the other champion. And I just thought, wouldn't it be useful if we had something like that, but about accessibility? And we came up with this idea, this really simple idea, that all we wanted people to do was join a network and make sure that the one job that we asked them to do is make sure that accessibility is discussed in every sprint. It's never deferred. And you don't have to, if you want to be a champion that grows, your knowledge and skills around your particular discipline, whatever it is that you do, then we will
right.
support that. You don't have to. You just got to make sure it's continuously talked about. And this grew, and other organizations heard about it and came to see what we were doing. And then other champions networks started. I think there was one I think one of the first ones was in Barclays Bank, and Google started one, and Intuit, and Ted Drake's one, Intuit, which is phenomenal. It's such a brilliant network. And then Charlie Turrell, who was the manager of the network, who was with me at the BBC, and I were presenting at a meetup. And I think there was some problem with the software for bringing the questions in. It wasn't happening. And you've got two people who are ADHD with an open mic in 5 minutes. And which is always a bad thing in these kind of situations. And within 5 minutes, the pair of us had started discussing this. Why don't we have a network of people who run networks, or people who want to run networks and come and find out about it? What about cultural change?
Yeah.
Why don't we get people together around that? And we just started spitballing that. And it kind of went viral. And within a few weeks, we must have had over 100 organizations contacting us saying, do you know
Amazing.
that network? Can we join it? And we were like, we were just talking. And so we set up a network. We got Heather and Heather Hepburn from Skyscanner. And there was a little group of us, and David Tisserand from Ubisoft and people. So there was a group of us got together, and we formed a group. We get together. It's just voluntary. It's completely voluntary run. And we get together every month, and we talk about things, and we get together and we group, and we have a channel on LinkedIn, and we've got about 1,300 members on it now. It's grown in very short space of time, very large. And we get together and we talk about something that doesn't usually get talked about. So we've got a session coming up in a couple of weeks, and a lot of it is going to be about culture, and where culture reflects into brand, but it also into organizational culture. We're going to do a panel. And then what we do is we do a thing called speed dating afterwards, where everyone goes off into little rooms, and it's all online on Zoom, and we have 5-10 minutes to talk about it and meet new friends and connect. and
I love,
then you get,
I love,
and you don't know who you're going to end up with. It's a random scattering of like 4 people will turn up in a room together, and we've got 10 minutes. Let's
yeah,
all chat. And so it's the whole thing is making people connect and getting us to think about those things on the periphery, the edge around this, and
yeah.
those softer skill things that we need to deal with.
It was a great privilege to be a part of it. I just got Heather's email I think yesterday on the next show. I really got to get myself woven back in. But Gareth, I just want to say thank you very much for joining our show here.
Loved it.
We've been colleagues and friends for a long time. I expect it will continue for
Yeah.
at least maybe. You've got 10 years younger than me, so you'll probably go longer. But
I'm catching up. I think
yeah.
I'm catching up. I think you're not growing. You're like Peter Pan. You don't grow old, and I'm catching up with you. So
Well, thank you very much. So for our listeners here on HearSay, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Gareth Ford Williams, formerly of the BBC, now of Ably and other new initiatives. HearSay is produced by Sojin Rank, Mike Barton, Mariella, Paulino, and Missy Jensen. Edited by Alex Dorrier. If you enjoyed this podcast and don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.